Night pressed heavily over the channel like an old grief returning, its salt-stained breath sweeping across the hidden huts of Bletchley Park, where exhausted minds fought a war made not of bullets, but of patterns and probabilities. Inside Hut 8, the dim lamps trembled, as if they too feared the weight of what the codebreakers carried. Alan Turing stood alone before the massive bomb machine, its wheels humming with a mechanical restlessness that mirrored the turmoil inside him. For days, they had intercepted fragments of a new German transmission, something different from the usual encrypted naval coordinates, something that hinted at a sudden movement of U-boats converging on a single unsuspecting vessel. Cross-referenced logs indicated the ship carried refugees fleeing the violence spreading across occupied Europe, families who had left everything behind believing the Channel would offer them mercy. But the Admiralty had deemed the intelligence unverified, and strict orders had come down forbidding Turing and his team from redirecting resources to it. They were to focus on the Atlantic convoys only, the strategic ones, the ones that sharpened the war machine. Yet Turing felt the numbers tug at him like a cry in the dark, the statistical whisper of hundreds of lives suspended above a silent abyss. He moved across the room with a clarity that bordered on defiance, feeding the final settings into the machine even after the lights were supposed to be cut. The clacking rotors spun faster, searching for the one truthful alignment hidden inside a universe of permutations. And with each metallic snap, Turing felt something inside him anchor deeper into the certainty that he was right to resist. The others had already left for the night, weary and obedient, afraid of violating the commandments of secrecy and chain of command. But Turing had always been shaped by a different logic, one that saw human lives as variables whose value could never be dismissed as operational noise. As the bomber whirred, he imagined the ship drifting through the darkness, unaware of the metal wolves encircling it. Imagined children leaning against the railings while parents whispered promises they were not sure they could keep. The machine jolted suddenly and spat out a configuration that glowed in the dimness like a revelation. The code unfolded rapidly into coordinates, speed estimates, attack vectors. There was no longer doubt. The ship would be struck before dawn. He grabbed the results and ran through the cold corridor toward the communications room, his footsteps echoing with the urgency of a man carrying a truth too heavy for one body. Yet the operator on duty froze when he saw the papers, reminding Turing that no transmissions could be sent without authorization. Violation meant court-martial. It meant the dismantling of everything they were building at Bletchley. But Turing insisted, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the terrible burden of foresight, explaining that the cipher was real, that hundreds would die if they waited for morning. The operator hesitated only a moment before giving way to the force of his conviction, sending a coded alert to the nearest Royal Navy patrol. In that moment, Turing felt a strange mixture of dread and relief, as if he had stepped outside the boundaries of the world he knew and into a moral unknown where only conscience could draw the map. Hours later, when his superiors discovered the unauthorized transmission, Bletchley Park shook with controlled fury. Doors slammed, clipped voices rose, reprimands were drafted with the precision of sharpened blades. Turing stood before them silent, rain dripping from his coat, refusing to justify what could not be undone. The matter reached Churchill himself, who had been roused from a restless sleep to hear that one of his most brilliant yet troublesome minds had defied standing orders to divert military attention toward a single refugee ship. Advisors expected the Prime Minister to react with explosive indignation, but Churchill listened in a long, contemplative quiet, staring toward the dim glow of a dying fireplace as the storm outside battered the windows. There was something about Turing's act that stirred old memories in him, of battles fought not on fields, but within the moral chambers of leadership, where every decision carved scars no one could see. In that quiet office lined with maps and shadows, Churchill finally uttered the words that would travel through the ranks like a tremor. Sometimes the right thing is not the ordered thing. And with that, he refused to punish Turing, choosing instead to let the night's defiance settle into history as an unspoken pact between necessity and humanity. The ship survived, the refugees lived, and Turing returned to Hut 8 with the weight of Churchill's unexpected verdict. pressing against his already burdened heart. The morning after the storm carried a stillness so fragile that even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Across Bletchley Park, the cold air rang with rumours. Word had spread in hushed fragments that the Prime Minister himself had intervened, that Turing had escaped ruin by the narrow grace of something Churchill had seen in him. No one spoke openly, yet every glance that met him in the corridors carried a mixture of awe, fear, and quiet disapproval. The mathematicians who once debated endlessly with him now avoided eye contact, afraid that proximity to rebellion might stain them. For Turing, silence was both punishment and refuge. He returned to the machines, to the equations that never lied, immersing himself in the motion of gears and currents, the rhythm of logic that drowned out human judgment. But even as he worked, he felt the ghosts of those who had survived because of his choice. Faces he would never know, voices that would never thank him, the invisible choir of the saved. Churchill, meanwhile, carried the event like a secret ember. He saw in Turing's defiance something rare, a moral instinct unshackled by bureaucracy. The war had turned men into numbers, villages into coordinates, compassion into a luxury of the unwounded. Yet in that single act of disobedience, Churchill glimpsed the reason they fought at all. He requested Turing's name be added quietly to a list of those whose work would never be forgotten, though no one was to know it yet. History, he often mused, had little patience for saints or rebels until it needed them. Days turned into weeks. The ship that Turing had saved reached the English coast, battered but intact. Its passengers, unaware of how close they had come to becoming just another unspoken tragedy, disembarked under grey skies. Among them were children clutching suitcases, women carrying photographs of the dead, old men who still looked back at the horizon as if expecting the sea to reclaim them. Their names never reached Turing, but something within him sensed their presence in the world, a quiet counterweight to the endless statistics of loss. It was that sense that mathematics could save lives if only wielded with compassion that fueled his work with renewed intensity. Yet not everyone shared Churchill's forgiveness. Within the circles of command, Turing's insubordination was considered a dangerous precedent. To some, it suggested that intellect could override hierarchy, that conscience could trump command. The intelligence directorate whispered of measures to ensure loyalty, of tighter supervision. Still, Churchill held firm, refusing to allow Turing's brilliance to be dimmed by discipline. "Let him be odd," he once remarked to an aide. "The war will end sooner if we have more men who think strangely." At night, when the others had gone home, Turing often lingered, running his hands across the cold metal of the bomb as if it were a living creature that understood him. He thought of logic not as a cage but as a language through which mercy could speak. The incident with the ship had changed him, not into a hero, but into a man more aware of the distance between right and permitted. The rules that governed him now seemed smaller than the silence of those who suffered unseen. He began to see patterns in everything: the pulse of radio static, the rhythm of footsteps, the flicker of candlelight against the blackout curtains. Somewhere, beneath all that chaos, he believed the universe held a code that explained not only war, but love, cruelty, and the strange arithmetic of survival. One evening, as he walked through the rain-drenched garden outside Hut 8, a figure emerged from the mist. Commander Denniston, his superior, the man who had once scolded him for every unorthodox idea. Denniston stopped a few paces away, studying Turing's pale, sleepless face. He didn't speak of the ship or of Churchill's pardon. Instead, he said only, "Next time, consult us first." Turing looked at him with the weary eyes of someone who had already crossed too many moral borders and answered softly, "Next time, I hope there is no need." The commander nodded, almost imperceptibly, then turned away, leaving Turing alone with the rain and the faint hum of distant machinery. Inside, the lamps flickered. War moved on, but in the hidden depths of Britain's code-breaking heart, the memory of that night, when one man chose empathy over obedience, lingered like an unspoken truth that no encryption could conceal. If this part moved you, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It helps bring together everyone who believes history should still be felt. Winter arrived at Bletchley not with snow, but with a bitter dampness that seeped into every brick and every bone. The war outside raged with an intensity that no cipher could quantify. Cities burned, skies screamed, and the very air seemed to hum with the metallic scent of inevitability. Inside the code-breaking huts, fatigue became a second skin. Yet for Alan Turing, exhaustion was no longer the enemy. It was a familiar companion, whispering beside him as he bent over reams of intercepted Enigma traffic, his fingers trembling with both calculation and doubt. The incident with the ship had marked him. It was not a victory to celebrate, but a haunting. He could no longer look at a column of numbers without wondering what pulse, what breath, what child's heartbeat lay beneath it. Every code broken now carried the question, whose life does this save? Whose does it condemn? Churchill, in his own war room, watched the tides of conflict shift like great violent weather. Intelligence reports from Bletchley had grown more precise, more prophetic, guiding naval movements with uncanny accuracy. He knew Turing's mind was behind much of it, though the mathematician's name remained classified, buried beneath the bureaucracy of secrecy. In the dim hours before dawn, the Prime Minister often found himself staring at the narrow sliver of light that cut across his desk, thinking not of armies, but of individuals. Men like Turing, whose invisible rebellions sustained the fragile morality of their cause. Churchill's advisors urged him to impose tighter control over the cryptanalysts, warning that genius without discipline was a liability. He ignored them. "We cannot win a war of machines with men who think like machines," he wrote in the margin of one memo. Meanwhile, Turing's team noticed subtle changes in him. He spoke less, listened more. His mind, once restless with abstract thought, now carried an almost spiritual intensity, as if each decoded message was a confession extracted from the chaos of the world. One night, after days without rest, he solved a particularly cruel sequence of naval transmissions. They revealed the planned sinking of a convoy near Iceland, dozens of merchant ships, hundreds of men. The pattern was clear, the meaning unmistakable. But this time, the Admiralty believed him immediately. No one questioned his logic. No one dared delay the warning. The ships altered course, and when the German U-boats surfaced in their appointed killing ground, they found only empty sea. The triumph was quiet, but absolute. Yet Turing did not celebrate. He sat alone beneath the dim light, the decoded messages spread before him like evidence from a crime he could not unsee. Victory, he thought, was only the art of choosing who dies a little later. Days later, a sealed envelope arrived for him, not through military channels but by hand. Its wax bore the seal of the Prime Minister's office. Inside, written in Churchill's dense, impatient handwriting, was a single line. "When rules fail to serve life, remember that life must remain the highest rule." There was no signature, no formality, just that one sentence. A quiet bridge between two men who would never truly meet as equals, but who understood one another through the shared loneliness of command. Turing folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his notebook, beside equations and scribbles that only he could decipher. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to smile. Not with pride, but with relief that someone, somewhere, had seen him not as a machine, but as a man. The winter deepened. The walls of Bletchley Park glistened with condensation. The air smelled of ink and sweat and cold tea. Outside, blackout curtains turned every window into a mirror. Turing often caught his own reflection staring back, pale, gaunt, eyes burning with a kind of fever that no rest could cure. He wondered if conscience could exist in mathematical form, if there was a formula for the moment when obedience ceased to be virtue. The machine spun endlessly beside him, its rotors clicking out patterns that echoed like a metronome for the heartbeat of war. Somewhere in the noise, He thought he could hear the sound of the sea again. The night he saved those people, the waves slapping against the hull, the cries of unseen lives brushing against his own. He knew he would never tell anyone. The secret would live in him like a second pulse. When Churchill next received word from Bletchley, it was not about defiance, but about progress. A new breakthrough in decoding Enigma's naval cipher. He read the report with quiet satisfaction, though his advisors complained that the mathematicians were becoming too independent. Churchill smiled grimly. "Good," he said. "Let them stay that way. I'd rather have a room of dangerous thinkers than a room of obedient fools." Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "It was the disobedient one who saved the ship." And so the strange bond between Churchill and Turing remained, invisible, unrecorded, yet essential. The Prime Minister had once described the British spirit as the refusal to bow, even to reason, when conscience commands otherwise. Perhaps that was what he had seen in the young man who spoke in formulas instead of speeches. Perhaps that was what saved them all in the end. If you felt this part deepen the connection between Churchill and Turing, subscribe. Stories like these deserve to be remembered in full. Spring came quietly to Bletchley, though it was a season without colour. The war had leached the brightness from England, leaving behind only muted skies and fields that seemed to wait for permission to grow again. Inside the huts, however, there was movement. The rhythm of pens, the pulse of typewriters, the endless spinning of machines that devoured secrecy and spat out fragments of revelation. Alan Turing's fame within the shadows had grown, though none beyond those fences would ever know it. He had become both revered and feared, a man whose intuition seemed to pierce straight through the enemy's mind. Yet beneath that brilliance, something else stirred, an exhaustion that reached deeper than the body, a kind of spiritual erosion brought on by the constant arithmetic of life and death. He had long stopped counting the nights he did not sleep. The hum of the bomb had become his lullaby, the clatter of decoded messages his only prayer. Sometimes, when he caught himself staring too long at the cogs turning, he felt as though the machine was watching him back, reminding him that every victory came at a cost invisible to those who celebrated it. The faces of the saved ship's passengers still haunted him in dreams, not because they suffered, but because they lived. Survival had its own weight, and Turing carried it like a quiet debt to the universe. Churchill, in those same months, stood before Parliament with the resolve of a man balancing his soul on the edge of fire. Every report from Bletchley tightened the invisible thread that connected him to the mathematician he had never formally met. Though their worlds could not have been more different, one born of politics, the other of patterns, they shared the same solitude of command. The Prime Minister often reread the reports from the Intelligence Division and saw traces of Turing's mind hidden within the precision of the data. He found comfort in it, the same way a commander finds faith in a soldier he will never meet. And yet, he knew too that genius was a fragile resource, easily broken by bureaucracy or fear. So, one morning, Churchill issued a quiet directive that the cryptanalysts were to receive every facility and every support, a phrase that would later be known as his Action This Day order. Those 3 words, scrawled in his impatient red ink, changed everything at Bletchley Park. Suddenly, supplies arrived, repairs were made, and morale lifted. No one knew it was because of Turing's defiance months earlier, but the old mathematician in Hut 8 did. He saw in that sudden generosity not merely gratitude, but understanding. Somewhere, in the upper echelons of command, someone remembered that mercy and efficiency could coexist. Still, not all were pleased. Deniston's patience had frayed thin. He respected Turing's intellect, but distrusted his disregard for hierarchy. The mathematician's mind operated outside the military's comfort, unpredictable, uncontainable. During one tense meeting, Deniston remarked coldly that one man cannot decide the course of the war. Turing, his tone flat, replied, "No one man does, but one can decide whether a life is worth saving." The room fell silent. No one dared quote him, but the words hung in the air long after he left, vibrating with the uncomfortable truth that reason without compassion was simply another form of madness. Meanwhile, far across the channel, the consequences of their work unfolded. German convoys faltered. Submarines, once invincible, found themselves hunted. The tides of war shifted subtly, invisibly, like a great wheel turning. And with each victory, Turing's solitude deepened. He began to withdraw further from the world, seeking refuge in his equations, in his machines, in the cold logic that at least obeyed its own laws. Yet sometimes late at night, he would open the small notebook where he had hidden Churchill's message and read those words again. Life must remain the highest rule. It steadied him, not as encouragement, but as absolution. One fog-covered dawn, an unexpected visitor arrived at Bletchley under discreet escort. The man was old, weary, dressed in a heavy overcoat that carried the scent of cigars and rain. He did not introduce himself, and no one dared to ask his name. But when Turing was summoned to meet him in the dim corridor outside Hut 8, he immediately understood. Churchill's presence was both thunderous and human, the kind of gravity that could silence a storm. For a moment, neither spoke. The Prime Minister studied the pale, awkward mathematician before him, then said softly, "I hear you save lives as easily as others save numbers." Turing looked down, unsure how to respond. Churchill's eyes softened. "History will forget your name," he continued, "but not your consequence." It was the only meeting they ever had. No records, no witnesses, just two men bound by the secret weight of choice. As Churchill departed into the mist, he turned once more and added, "The next time you disobey me, make sure you're right again." There was no irony in his tone, only a tired affection, as if he were speaking to a son who had done something both foolish and magnificent. When Turing returned to his hut, he sat quietly before the bombe, letting his hands rest on the metal surface. For the first time in months, he closed his eyes and exhaled. The machine, as if recognizing the stillness, slowed its hum. The war would continue, codes would multiply, and choices would grow heavier. But for that brief morning, he allowed himself to believe that reason and compassion had finally shaken hands. If you're still here, carried by the pulse of this story, subscribe. These moments of forgotten courage deserve to be remembered. The following months unfolded like a long inhale before the next explosion of history. D-Day loomed closer, though few at Bletchley knew how near they stood to the hour when everything would turn. The corridors were alive with tension, footsteps quick, voices hushed, eyes dark from sleepless calculation. Hut 8, under Turing's quiet dominion, had become a sanctuary of obsession. The machines never stopped. The paper reels spooled endlessly, carrying with them the secret pulse of the world. And in the center of that constant rhythm sat Turing, gaunt and spectral, his mind half in the realm of logic and half in the ache of conscience that no equation could soothe. He worked with the precision of a man aware that failure was measured in human lives. The data spoke of convoys, air raids, mines beneath the sea, each transmission a fragment of destiny disguised as numbers. The more he read, the more he understood how thin the membrane between survival and oblivion truly was. The ship he had once saved remained a scar on his memory, a reminder that the war was not fought only in trenches or skies, but in the quiet defiance of those who refused to look away. Churchill's voice still carried through the island like a drumbeat. We shall never surrender. And yet behind that thunder lay the fragile machinery of minds like Turing's, unseen but essential. The Prime Minister knew it well. He received the coded reports daily, their accuracy so uncanny that he sometimes wondered whether God himself whispered through those circuits. When his advisors warned that Turing's team needed stricter supervision, Churchill dismissed them with a growl. "You don't leash lightning," he said. "You learn to hold it without burning your hands." Still, Turing was burning. His health waned under the relentless weight of secrecy and solitude. He spoke rarely now, except to his machines, or to Joan Clark, the quiet brilliance beside him who understood his silences better than words could. She saw the exhaustion in his trembling hands, the hollow in his eyes, and yet she also saw the fragile light that refused to die there. One evening, as they worked through intercepted signals, She told him softly, "You carry too much." He didn't look up. "It's not the codes," he murmured. "It's what's inside them." The breakthrough that would change everything came unexpectedly. A new German cipher, believed unbreakable, appeared in naval transmissions. The enigma had evolved, growing more complex, almost sentient in its defiance. But Turing had learned that machines, like men, always repeated their fears. Within the patterns of this new cipher, he saw not randomness, but rhythm, a trembling uncertainty that betrayed its human origin. For weeks, he pursued it relentlessly, sleeping only in brief fragments, his mind unraveling the enemy's thoughts, one rotation at a time. And then, one night, it happened. The bomb halted, a sequence aligned, the code yielded, the room filled with a stunned silence. It was as though the machine itself had gasped. When the message was translated, its meaning struck them cold. The Germans were preparing to withdraw part of their fleet to defend the French coast, unknowingly leaving an opening in the channel. The invasion routes could be recalibrated. Thousands could live because of this one revelation. Turing stared at the decoded text, feeling none of the triumph that others might have. He only whispered, "Now they will send them to die somewhere else." But Churchill saw differently. When he received the intelligence, he stood motionless for several minutes, his cigar burning down to ash. He understood at once the strategic enormity of what Turing had accomplished. This was not mere cleverness, it was salvation disguised as logic. He ordered preparations accelerated, his voice quiet but fierce. "Tell them to move heaven and earth. This is the hand of Providence, written in numbers." And yet, even as the machinery of war surged forward, Churchill thought again of that night months ago. The young man who had defied him to save a single ship. It is strange, he mused privately, how one act of mercy can ripple through history until it shapes the tide itself. He never shared that thought aloud, but he carried it, the way soldiers carry lucky charms into battle, not for faith, but for remembrance. When the D-Day landings finally came, Bletchley was silent. No cheers, no clinking of glasses, only the endless hum of machines. They decoded the aftermath in real time, the losses, the triumphs, the cries between frequencies. Turing listened, hollow-eyed, knowing that behind every code broken lay both salvation and sorrow. For each ship that reached the shore, another sank unseen. War, he realized, was not about victory, but about endurance. The moral endurance to keep believing that one life saved still mattered amid 1,000 lost. That night, when the reports finally stopped coming, Turing left the hut and walked alone through the garden. The moon hung pale above the blackout clouds, the grass wet with the dew of silence. Somewhere far away the world was changing because of what he had done. And yet here, all was still. He closed his eyes and thought of Churchill's words. Sometimes the right thing is not the ordered thing. In that moment, he finally understood. Disobedience, when born of conscience, was its own form of obedience, not to men, but to humanity itself. If this chapter reached you, let us know by leaving a quiet word of support. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so these forgotten souls are never lost again. The summer that followed felt like a wound that refused to close. Europe was burning itself into memory, and yet the air at Bletchley Park carried something like hope. Fragile, exhausted, but alive. The Allied forces had broken through the beaches of Normandy. The German codes had grown erratic, and the end of the war began to glimmer faintly at the far edge of imagination. Still, within the huts, no one celebrated. The codebreakers knew better than to mistake silence for peace. Every decrypted message was another window into suffering, another reminder that victory, when it came, would be built upon the bones of millions. Alan Turing worked with a kind of haunted calm. His defiance had long ago ceased to feel like rebellion. It had become simply the way he existed in a world that mistook obedience for virtue. The ship he had saved, the message from Churchill, the lives altered by unseen hands, all of it had woven itself into the fabric of who he was. Now, he moved through his days with the quiet dignity of a man who had accepted both the cost and the necessity of his conscience. The relationship between him and Churchill, though distant, had deepened through silence. They never exchanged another letter, never met again. But the Prime Minister continued to protect Bletchley with the full force of his authority. When officials proposed redistributing funds or restricting non-military eccentricities, Churchill would cut through the noise with a single growled command: "Leave the mathematicians alone." Those who understood his tone never argued again. In those final months, Turing's breakthroughs accelerated. His team learned to anticipate the enemy's movements before they happened, decoding not just messages, but intent. The German war machine, once an unstoppable cipher of destruction, began to collapse under the weight of its own patterns. Yet even as their success grew, so did the sense of futility that shadowed it. For every convoy saved, another city burned. For every victory claimed, there were children lost beneath the rubble. The logic of war, Turing realized, was not a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy to be endured. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window of his small office and watch the fog rise over the empty lawns. The machines were quiet now, their wheels still, their purpose temporarily fulfilled. He thought of the people who had died without knowing that their fate had been debated in this place of pencils and cables, that strangers had fought for them in silence. He thought of the moral paradox that had defined his existence, that mercy had once required defiance, that compassion had found its only voice in disobedience. Churchill too felt the weight of that paradox. The war had turned him into a monument, but monuments carry their own loneliness. In private, he often revisited that night when Turing's insubordination had reached his desk. Sometimes the right thing is not the ordered thing. Those words had not been a judgment, but a confession. He had seen too much of war's machinery to believe that rules could ever encompass all that was human. Turing had simply acted on the truth that Churchill had long known but could not always follow: that conscience must sometimes rebel to remain alive. As the war drew closer to its end, Bletchley began to unravel quietly. Files were sealed, documents burned, machines dismantled. The people who had lived their entire lives within the rhythm of ciphers suddenly found themselves staring into the unknown silence of peace. Turing watched as his colleagues left, one by one, carrying secrets they could never speak aloud. When his turn came, he stood before the great machine one last time, placing his hand against the cool metal as if to thank it, or forgive it. He walked out into the morning light. The sky was pale, and the first birds were singing, as though the world had finally remembered how to breathe. He had no medals, no public recognition, only the quiet knowledge that somewhere in the endless ledger of war, there was a single line, one ship, one night, one decision, that had bent the arc of history toward mercy. And far away, in his office of smoke and shadows, Churchill received the final intelligence report from Bletchley. He read it in silence, then murmured, "History will never know his name, but it will live in his consequence." If this part reached you, leave your thoughts below and stay with us for the final chapter. The ending, like Turing's own life, is both beautiful and unbearable. The war ended not with fanfare, but with silence. A silence so vast it seemed to swallow the sound of years, of sirens, engines, weeping, explosions, leaving only the hollow echo of what humanity had done to itself. Across Europe, the smoke thinned, revealing ruins where cities once breathed, and faces that no longer knew how to smile. Victory parades filled the streets, but the hearts behind the cheers were weary, uncertain, changed. At Bletchley Park, the huts stood empty, their walls still humming faintly with the ghosts of secrets once too immense to speak aloud. The machines were dismantled, the papers burned, and history was sealed shut with official silence. The people who had broken the unbreakable were told to forget that they had ever existed. Alan Turing returned to a world that could not understand him. His war was over, but his isolation had only begun. He walked the streets of Cambridge again, a man both liberated and imprisoned by knowledge no one was allowed to name. The ship he had once saved still haunted him, not as guilt, but as a symbol, proof that compassion, when chosen over obedience, could alter the current of fate. Yet the society he had defended so fiercely offered him no compassion in return. His mind, once Britain's invisible weapon, became his quiet undoing. The secrets he had kept for his country became barriers that kept the world from ever knowing his worth. Churchill, now an old man surrounded by the ghosts of his own decisions, often thought of the nameless mathematician in Hut 8. History had moved on, hungry for new narratives, eager to forget the quiet wars fought by minds instead of armies. But Churchill remembered. He kept Turing's name in his private notes, underlined once, not as a record, but as a debt. Sometimes he would sit by the fire, reading dispatches from the post-war years, and think how strange it was that a man who could command legions still envied the moral clarity of one who had chosen conscience over command. When Turing died years later, alone, misunderstood, reduced to whispers and rumours, the world barely noticed. But in the long corridors of memory, his defiance lived on. The ship he saved had carried families who would have descendants. Among them, a child who would one day become a scientist, another who would write books, another who would tell the story of how one man's refusal to obey a cruel logic had preserved the fragile miracle of ordinary lives. The echo of that night, the night Turing had broken orders to save a ship full of strangers, rippled outward through generations, shaping a future he would never see. Churchill, near the end of his life, was asked in an interview what he believed had truly won the war. He smiled faintly, his eyes dim, but still burning with the old fire. Machines helped, he said. Courage more so. But in the end, it was conscience. The courage to defy even our own commands when humanity required it. The interviewer assumed he spoke of generals and soldiers. Churchill did not correct him. Some truths, he believed, belonged to silence. And so, the legacy of that night remained hidden, not in medals or monuments, but in the unseen places where conscience and courage meet. The ship survived, the children lived, the war ended, and a quiet, fragile mercy slipped into the bloodstream of history. Alan Turing's defiance became not a scandal, but a parable. That sometimes the bravest act in war is not to fight, but to refuse the inhuman command. If this ending reached you, if it made you pause, if it made you remember, then take a moment to honor it. Like, share, and subscribe so that the stories of those who fought with conscience, not weapons, are never silenced again.